You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
So, Brendan, are we playing Rosetta Thorn and Briar at our Nationals this year?
So it's very exciting because my theory is that Dusk Till Dawn is not balanced around Rosetta Thorn being legal. Hot take?
Well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, wouldn't you think that LSS would just drop in a random 2 points into the Living Legend leaderboard from somewhere to make sure that Briar hit Living Legend? Because newsflash, Brendan, 998, that is the Living Legend points. As we record, we've just found out that Briar, post the Road to National season, has achieved 998 total Living Legend points and will survive this next ban suspended announcement where it would go to Living Legend if it hit 1,000 points like Ultim will by the skin of its teeth. Literally, that's one Road to Nationals win. That's the difference. And there was a lot of discussion this past weekend about people, Briar mains conceding finals to avoid. I don't know how true things like this are, but it's funny.
So I just want to follow up some questions on that. Do you think that the Dusk Till Dawn meta would be more interesting or less interesting with Briar Living Legend? So Briar not currently having a massive impact in the meta could have a resurgence as Oldhim leaves. Let's not speculate on the power level of Vincent or any of that quite yet. But assuming Oldhim is gone, do you think that the meta would be more interesting or less interesting with Briar in it?
That's a tough question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we've seen this card from Dusk Till Dawn that is a Briar specialization Earth card, yes. Right? Which is very interesting. So, people are going to get at least one season to play with that card in Class Constructed, whereas maybe we thought that was going to be, Blitz only or Living Legend format when that eventually arrives. We're now going to get the ability to play with that card during this next Class Constructed season. So, interesting. I don't know. I mean, it really depends. We're entering a Runeblade set and you're coming in with one of the most powerful weapons in the game still available to play. So it's whether it's Briar, whether it's Viserai, whether it's Vincent, it's really hard to say at this point. We can't, we know nothing about the set other than the two sort of cards we've seen. But I'll tell you what, it looks a lot more powerful than the flail.
Yeah, it's pretty funny because I could care less about Briar being in or out of the format, but it's really Rosetta Thorn. I think that Dusk Till Dawn, I don't know if it's going to be better or worse, but I am more intrigued that Rosetta Thorn is legal going into Dusk Till Dawn than I would have been if not. Because I do think that LSS might have thought that Briar wrote a Living Legend. I don't know. We did see a really powerful Briar specialization. I think that's what's got the juices cooking right now, but I don't know. We'll see.
I'm more excited to play Viserai with Rosetta Thorn. That's been that's been what I've enjoyed the most with Rosetta Thorn, is playing Viserai over the past, 2 years. But I have a question for you. This is not the first time we've seen a hero hit effectively a one win and out situation. We saw this with, I believe Prism get this close previously. Prism ultimately ends up winning the, is it the calling? I want to make sure I get this.
In the Pro Tour Lille.
Yeah. So I guess my question is the Living Legend format in need of Living Legend system in need of another immediate sort of overhaul? Is this point system, I heard a lot of talk this past weekend about Briars conceding, about people putting bounties on Briars to get the Briar to the points to get it out of the format, this kind of manipulation of a point system because it only goes to the winner, these two Living Legend points. Could this have been done, is there a potential this could be done in a different way? Should Living Legend be split across the top 4 heroes, across the first and second heroes? Is this sort of I don't want to say a gameable system, because I guess all systems can be at some degree, but this also feels like maybe it's not quite a right system for what we're trying to achieve here with Living Legend.
I think this is a hot take, but I think that the Living Legend system is not actually well thought out and is kind of just something that was thrown together, and we're just kind of running with it despite the game scaling to, different sizes, right? Where we were when this iteration of Living Legend came out versus where we are now is wildly different in terms of the number of events that are taking place and how fast these things can actually rotate out and when they're rotating out, right? There's not a true science to taking heroes in and out of the format. It kind of just happens, and you can see that system potentially break down. I think in the past, I've been more critical of it because I've felt the pressure of the system just not, what felt like it was not working, right? But I will say, despite the architecture of the current state of Living Legends seeming to be sort of just tossed together, I do think that so far in Flesh and Blood, for the competitive scene, Living Legend has resulted in the best changes in the formats that we've seen so far. Like most of the formats that I've seen have an overhaul in recent history have not been from new sets releasing, but have been from heroes rotating out. And we've seen like wildly different changes in the meta that have been much more balanced, and it's felt like you could play more heroes because we had troublesome ones rotate out. So I've enjoyed the results of Living Legend, but I do think that the system, it doesn't scale infinitely, right? Like Fab gets 10 times bigger. The system theoretically doesn't work at all, I don't think. So could we see an overhaul? I do think we will. I think that it's the whole entire idea of Living Legend has been a developing system literally since the inception, right? A lot of people don't know this, but the OG Living Legend was one of the clunkiest, just hilarious things that Ellis has ever created. Basically, the hero would have to win like 10 events, and it didn't matter if it was limited or constructed, and it would get the one Living Legend point, and your name would be put on the website with some blurb about the tournament. Like, it was hilarious, right? But it's been overhauled, I think, 2 times since then, maybe even more. We've had some things tweaked around, values, etc. So, yeah, I know that was a bit of a spiel, but I do think that the system is not in its final form, and we will see changes. But despite it being imperfect, I think it's had a net positive on the game so far.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to something you said, which is people are going to probably see as a really hot take, which is, Living Legend has had a bigger impact than new sets on changing metagames. And I think new sets have a longer lasting impact, right? You see cards that continue to impact the game from set to set. And I think in the case of Outsiders in particular, for certain classes, they definitely have a much bigger impact than what Living Legend and a rotation of a hero can do. Look at Ranger, for example, right? But we've seen the format time and time again change dramatically as we've gone through these Living Legend sort of phases. So we just talked about Prism before, and Prism winning the Calling in Leal achieves Living Legend, right, by the skin of its teeth. I remember being in that hall and everyone being like, is it gonna the Briar, people were watching like the table and it was like, Briar's ahead, like Briar's got this game, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, the Prism's come back. I remember people talking about was Prism gonna Living Legend, and people like rooting for Prism to finally leave the format. And this is of course after the previous season where if Bravo won the PT Star of the Show, it wouldn't have been available for the ProQuest format for Pro Tour number 2. All these things, right? And so Prism Living Legends, we see a hero in the form of Icelander that was like super suppressed. We just barely saw it in Leal, and then all of a sudden with Prism Living Legend and the same set of cards effectively, we see Icelander really come to the forefront as one of the best decks of the format, right? So that immediate big change. So I think that's kind of like a hot take. I agree. I think it is. It just might not be as intuitive as people think in terms of the way that works, but it really does massively shake up the format and give big changes, because a lot of decks or strategies just aren't viable because of particular heroes. And I think Ultim Living Legend was going to always have more of an impact than Briar Living Legend anyway, I think. I mean, obviously it's hard to say with Dust to Dawn and what that set might do to the format, but Ultim Living Legend is a huge impact to what the format can and will look like, I think, as we move forward into this next season.
Yeah, 2 things. One, do you remember the roar in the event venue at in Leal when Prism won that calling? It was I think it was the loudest noise that occurred that weekend, right? People were so invested in Prism Living Legending and watching that calling final match. It got a lot of publicity. It was a big deal. Outside of that, just kind of zooming out to like Flesh and Blood holistic design, I don't know how I feel about Living Legend in terms of how it affects card pools and people's sort of viability to play the game based off their collection. Because due to Flesh and Blood being a hero-based game, I know there's a lot of people that sort of take on a more role-play aspect or just like to specialize in a specific hero. And I'm not sure how much I like the part where, Prism rotates out and this massive card pool, like, maybe someone is literally just a light illusionist player. They might identify as a Prism player, but they just have light illusionist cards. Prism rotates out and then they just can't play with the cards for like a very, very long time. it's a weird place, right? Because that definitely sucks for those people. I know I've heard it affecting people in a really negative way where they're like, they didn't want to play anymore. And I'm just not sure how much I like that part of the system. And that's the main thing I want to see overhauled is better support for a class / talent pool that gets Living Legend out to a hero. I would like to see a new hero come in quicker to support that card pool that basically just becomes, relatively unplayable. Obviously there's alternate formats like, Pauper or Blitz potentially, etc. But for me, that's sort of my critical issue with Living Legend in its current state, which is a fundamental issue.
I kind of think you said some of the reasons why I don't see it as much of an issue. You talked about there's formats like you can, if you're a Prism player, if you're a light illusionist player, you can still play your hero, I think. And I guess I compare it to, if you've ever played MOBAs or even to an extent some, online RPGs where it's like, okay, nerfs happen or changes happen to certain characters and your character is like unplayable maybe, or they're playable but just in a purely social fun way, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you still have that with Prism. If it was also banned in Blitz, I think that might be a bit of a different story. I understand people want to play Classic Constructed, but I think maybe if you play 2 or 3 classes, then you're always going to have these options available to you, right? Mm-hmm. I think. Yeah. So it's a bit of a catch-22 from LSS's standpoint as well, because you can only introduce so many heroes and you want to go down different pathways, right? I saw someone tweet this morning, I haven't heard about anything about Necromancer since we, that kind of lore drop a year ago. It's like, yeah, there's so many things for LSS still to explore from a character standpoint, from a class standpoint, from a talent standpoint. So it's really hard to service every single segment of not even just a class, because this is light illusions we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think you could even draw a parallel to something more direct like Magic, right? So in Magic, let's say you're playing like a standard deck and it is based, standard decks can often be based around a specific card, right? A card is just very powerful. That card gets banned. Maybe your Jund pile, your red, green, black pile, it sucks now. It was based around the one broken card. So you're still kind of getting banned out of the format in terms of the card pool that you're utilizing to play in your deck. It's just in Flesh and Blood, it's just so visceral, right? It's like now you literally have all these cards that say that text and they were attached to this hero that you had a lot of empathy for, and they're just unplayable to an extent, right? Other formats. For me, it's like I don't have a core issue with that existing. I understand that's a balancing-ish system we have in the game. I would just like to see a hero for the band's talent class, whatever, get introduced to the game faster. Maybe it could come in as an armory promo, stuff like that. I don't know if that's too tough on design, but I would just like to see it come back into the game a bit quicker than we've seen so far.
Fair enough. We can agree to disagree then. Mm-hmm. I personally really like the pace of reintroducing heroes in certain classes and talents. I like that we get to spend some time without them. I think it's interesting as someone who likes to deck build. It's interesting as sort of variety to the gameplay and variety to the events we see. And I think it makes LSS's job a lot more manageable from a balancing standpoint. But, I can understand both sides. I can see why people would be frustrated and want that. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that said, the kind of, I guess, the top of the show was Briar has not achieved Living Legend status and will be living through next season with Rosetta Thorn and Briar. And I can guarantee the first person to get notch up those 2 points is going to be well heralded, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen, right? It didn't happen, which that's the interesting event. But shortly after in the future, we can only assume those 2 points will be achieved. But yeah, ultimately, my sentiment is I'm excited. I'm happy that it happened this way.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Well, first of all, episode 113 of Arsenal Pass. Welcome to the pod. This week we're going to touch a little bit on. We've got a few different things to touch on, but I guess the main topic of the pod that we're going to talk about that isn't Briar Living Legend or not Living Legend is navigating Endgames. The more that the formats have, I think, started to slow down. Brendan, we've talked about this a little bit over the last couple of pods, the dominance of decks like Ultim, the rise of decks like Dromai, and a lot of interesting, Assassin coming into the format as well. These decks that grind out games, and a lot of interesting matchups that we've seen over this past Classic Constructed format, things like Ultim versus Dromai, Lexi versus Assassin, Lexi versus Ultim, Runeblades versus Guardians. We've seen this kind of really interesting second cycle, a meme as it was once in Arsenal Pass history, Brendan, the second cycle. We've actually seen it be super relevant in this most recent Classic Constructed format. And we're going to talk about how you navigate these Endgames, because it's kind of like one of our favorite things that has never come to fruition, really. And here it is.
Yeah, Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood in general is a game where you have to play to win, and I know that sounds really funky, but it's just not one of those games where you can kind of just play hand to hand, completely abstract from the rest of your deck and everything else that's going on and win, right? Like all of these different factors matter, and they start to compound as you move from the early game to the mid game to the end game, and the choices that you've made in the previous sections will sort of impact the later, and you need to be planning that from the start of the game.
Tell that to the Firemans during Uprising.
Well, yeah, some decks, maybe they get away with it.
I think we've seen through a lot of periods of Flesh and Blood that you've been able to get away with that more so than in others. And I think this one is particularly one where you might not be able to. I think there's a lot more diversity to the power level has definitely decreased set over set, right? We've seen powerful heroes be effectively banned or hit Living Legend. And yeah, this format is very, very interesting. Even the most, explosive and aggressive deck in the form of Lexi still has a lot of nuance and plays a lot of games that hit second cycle because of the rate that it goes through its cards and because of sort of the ability that decks are looking to defend Lexi with. So we're definitely going to talk about that. But I guess, first of all, Week in Flesh and Blood. I mean, I can sort of start. I'm flying out to Singapore tomorrow, Brendan. So very excited to be back in Singapore for another calling. I mean, the last calling Singapore was only 7 or 8 months ago, I think. 9 months ago, prior to Lille. So wait, no, that's longer than that. When was Lille? Almost a year. Anyway,
I don't know.
Back in Singapore.
Sometime in the past, right? It's like almost 12 months now because it closes around 12 months when we go back to Europe for Worlds, right?
Very true. Yep. So back to Singapore. Really looking forward to it. Such a cool place. One of my favorite places I've been to, just as a destination, but also to play Flesh and Blood. The community is amazing. Last time I was there, I got to hang out, play some like UPF at a local store, hang out with some of the Singapore community, and the events are great. Looking forward to this. On Friday, there is a Monarch sealed event that James White's going to be playing in. We'll be playing that, looking to, I think it's called like Take Down the Monarch or something like that. I don't know. But anyway.
It's going to be a soft field. James is a bit washed up these days, I think. No, I'm kidding, James. Hayden, you're attending the calling Singapore. Obviously, that's where you're going. 0 to 10, where would you rate your confidence in your potential to win that tournament?
I mean, I'll always give myself at least a 7.
Okay, but 7 to 10. Where do you rate yourself?
I feel pretty good about this event. I think in terms of preparation and testing, I've been able to do some good amounts of testing, which I feel like I haven't really been able to do for any events in sort of the past year. I would say maybe my nationals back at the start of last year, I was able to prepare quite. It was quite a succinct sort of testing process. I was able to, lock my deck in early and test the things I wanted to. And I've kind of done something similar a little bit this time, and just learn matchups, learn the deck I'm going to play. And that feels a lot, that's the sort of way that I prefer to prepare and be ready for an event, as opposed to, last minute sort of changing decks, changing deck lists. I think me and Brendan, we've talked about this a lot, the kind of impacts this has had on our sort of events in the past.
Makes them exciting.
Well, I was thinking Pro Tour Lille, but which is a bit of a wash for us, unfortunately. With but again, that was very different to I think how we prepared for Worlds. So yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this event. I feel reasonably confident. It's gonna be a really tough field, and there's a lot of international players coming in as well as a really strong SEA community. So of course, Singapore itself with the players there. So yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to it though. I can't wait to kind of get there, and it's only 7 hours on plane, so I'll entertain myself. You know what I did actually is I got my Switch out. I haven't played my Switch in like a year. I downloaded Skyrim, Brendan, and
Skyrim on a Switch. Yeah. What the hell?
Hey, it runs alright.
That's wild. Man, it's crazy. Yeah, I think that tangent, but some of the stuff you can do on Switch is crazy, but what people are doing on Steam Deck is even more wild.
Oh yeah, it's nuts.
Full-fledged games on that. Crazy. All right, yeah. So my Week in Flesh and Blood, absolutely nothing. Hey, there's a few times in your life, I think, as you progress through life from infancy to old age, there's a few times in your life occurrences where you will appreciate the power of modern medicine. And that's what I had. So I had a kidney infection, and then I had the antibiotics were not the right ones, and I switched. And Jesus Christ, that was one of those painful things I've ever gone through in my life. That was legitimately terrible. So I am better now, but oh my God. I've been sick before. Everybody's been sick, right? And you take antibiotics, you feel better, but this was like true pain. And having something that actually made me feel better, I had a revelation. I was like, wow, I'm so happy I live in the modern day. Holy shit. It was tough, dude. But yeah, better now. And yeah, I mean, I still don't know what I'm doing for nationals, Hayden. I still haven't heard anything. And I still know through like whatever back channels that I have access to that they're still trying to figure it out. So I don't know if I'm doing coverage. I don't know if I'm playing. Still kind of a toss up. I think if I do play, I'll probably play Kano. Play Kano, to be honest. It looks pretty powerful, and yeah, I'm at that stage, Hayden, where I think I'm getting close to. I want to play the decks that I just really enjoy, even at events like this. Yeah, so boomer fabs.
I was going to say that's leaning in, but I mean, we'll see how good Kano is with Dust of Dawn and kind of what the format looks like. I
can't get any worse, right? Like, no more.
Well, I really considered playing Kano for Singapore.
It's a good deck. I mean, it's a good deck. It's we were talking about it. I was going to play it. I was going to play it this past weekend in Rotana, but yeah, it's a good deck. It's a good deck. But yeah, things surely can't get worse. They can't print more Oasis Respite. No more Ward, surely.
Wow. More Ward. We already know there's more Ward. Anyway, on to the news, Brendan. I mean, top of the news on our list is Briar living legend? The answer is no, so we can move on. Final week of Road to Nationals happened this past week. I think there is one more week for parts of Europe because they missed out on 1 week because of calling Antwerp. So Road to Nationals swiftly wrapping up. I'm sure from there we'll see invite lists to Nationals. People who are trying to get on XP, the XP cutoff is upcoming. People will know where they stand when it comes to making sure they're in for their national championships, which, I mean, start very quickly. I mean, we're in early, I guess, but soon enough we'll be in mid-June, Brendan. Then we've got Dust of Dawn releasing in July. We've got these Monarch events, War of the Monarch events, which are coming up as well before the release of Dust of Dawn. And then we basically hit into the Road to National season in August. So it's coming around very, very quickly. Singapore is on this weekend, as we just talked about. There is coverage, I believe, for Singapore. Mm-hmm. I'll probably tweet out a link. I don't know.
I was going to say, do we know who's doing coverage? I'm assuming it's not going to be on Legend Story Series or Fab's channel. So it'll be on
I think it never is, but they will. I think it might be 1-2 Juice, who are a Singaporean-based group of content creators who I think are doing it. I believe they're casting it, so there will definitely be coverage somewhere. We'll post a link on Twitter. Maybe Brendan can reshare that as well. If you don't follow me for whatever reason, only follow Brendan. Sounds like a mistake.
Yeah, though. If you saw our Twitter numbers, you'd realize that everybody that follows me also follows you. It's like literally the same.
It just ticks up.
Yep.
What else was I going to say about Singapore? Oh yeah, come say hello if you're going to be there as well. Really looking forward to catching up with people. 6,000 subscribers is just around the corner, Brendan. We're almost there. So if you are, maybe you're not subbed to the channel, maybe listening on Spotify, do us a favor, jump across to YouTube, hit us a sub, hit us a like on the video. It means a lot to us, and we're about to
stand up and headbutt that subscribe button, karate chop that like button, help us get to 6K.
What have you been watching?
I don't know. So you got to get the people going.
If you're excited for Dust of Dawn, War and Monarch events are happening July 7th to July 9th. I'm definitely going to be playing one of these. There's some cool cold foil sort of prizes, and the Rainbow Foil Art Extended Herald of Ravages is available. Have those been given out before? Were those content creator ones? There's been so many Herald Foil Arts. I can't remember. Those were. Okay.
So there was definitely Herald of Protection. Was there also Ravages?
Yes.
I think Protection was the content creator, but man, for some reason, maybe Herald of Ravages is the only one that currently doesn't exist because there's...
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah.
War Tune was a Judge promo one, I think. Mm-hmm. So, or a different promo, but yeah. And there's also these cold foil new Prism, Advent of Thrones, and Vincent. So yeah, these events look really cool. These Royal Monarch events. So looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's Monarch Booster Draft format, which, if you're going to be attending a national championship, really good practice for a national championship that will also have Monarch Draft in it. If your nationals will have Monarch Draft, which is a big chunk of national events. So yeah, definitely get out. I mean, I'm literally going to go to as many as I can just because it's great practice for upcoming national season as well. And finding people that want to draft all the time is really hard. So any events that are draft, I think, are always worth sort of getting to.
Mm-hmm.
Battle Hardened Baltimore. I want to ask you about this. This is happening next weekend. So Singapore this weekend. Battle Hardened Baltimore is next weekend. I didn't know, Brendan, but this is a team event.
Yeah, it's a team event.
Outside team sealed and top 4 team draft. What are your thoughts on more of these team events? We've seen them, of course, the calling. Famously, last year we got the calling around this time last year, which was a team blitz just shout out to my team as making top 4 in the Australian one.
Yeah, shout out to my team making day 1.
Even Michael Hamilton couldn't carry you on that one, apparently.
Yeah. Well, it was a great event. I love team events. So the real question you should be asking me
They're amazing.
You should be asking me, why am I not going?
Should we have more of them?
Yeah, why?
Oh.
Well, the reason I'm not going is because now it's pretty late, to be honest. I had some people ask me if I wanted to play, and it was like $800 to fly to Baltimore. It is. I mean, we've talked about it before on the pod, but the travel costs,
trying to get to Baltimore, tough.
Yeah, travel costs are unfreaking believable these days. So yeah, I mean, genuinely just priced out of these battle hardens that aren't locally within like a 10-hour drive at this point. But I'm super excited for people to get to play. Looks really fun, and I'm very jealous. Those team events, especially, it's team sealed, I believe, too. And you probably said that. Those are extremely fun to play. I enjoy team sealed. I don't know if I enjoy it more than Team Blitz, because Team Blitz it's a fun sort of puzzle to try and crack, but Team Sealed is a very, very enjoyable experience. I got to play it a few times with Michael Fang and Yongji at the Realm Games events.
That's right. Yeah, you guys had a good run in that event. What do you think about this team events in general? Do you think there should be more of them? And if so, is Sealed a good format for it? Or would you just prefer they were things like Blitz?
So I think the Sealed is the most approachable version of this. Blitz is just a little bit prohibitive because, I mean, not a lot of people play it. Also, of course, you need more cards. But so I like Team Sealed because really anybody who's sort of entrenched in Flesh and Blood already can walk up and do a Team Sealed event. It's like any Sealed event, right? I love team events. I think they're great for the game. I wish there were more, but I understand and empathize with team events being maybe not the best for the entire community, because I think that you and we would have people to play with every time if we want to go to a team event, just because we've been in the game for a long time and we're content creators. That's how it is. And I understand potentially being in the position where you don't have a team, and maybe that search to try to just be a ringer or go find some, like quote unquote random team is maybe not a pleasurable experience. So there is a high barrier to entry to compete at these things. You have to have friends, and that's tough. And you have to have friends that you want to compete with. They're fun, etc. But yeah, I understand why they're limited. I think if they were super common, they might become taxing to people that didn't have teams that they were sort of prepared to go with. But overall, from my personal experience, they've been my favorite events so far.
Mm-hmm. I remember, so just throwing back to some old Magic events, and there was a Team Modern event here in Sydney, or it was in Australia anyway, a few years ago before I stopped playing Magic. And my friends came across from New Zealand, and we played the event, and it was one of the best events I've ever played. And it kind of really, I'd already played team events before that, but it really sparked me wanting to play more team events. And I think, if I remember, there was more players at that event than there were for the event the following year, which was not a team event. So it's quite interesting, I think. To your point, I agree it is maybe a little bit harder from an approachability standpoint, but if it's sealed, I also like your point. I think that makes it easy to approach. That's easier to potentially find players. And I will say, what happened with the Blitz one, I remember here in Australia for the Southern Hemisphere calling that happened at the same time as the Europe and the North American calling for Team Blitz, is that people just, they helped each other. Like, community were helping each other. They were like, oh, I have a player here who's at my locals. They need, there's two of them. Maybe they need one more player. They're playing these two decks. Does someone want to join them? Like, people were just putting out things and getting teams together. Even on the Friday before, people were putting teams together, which is quite a cool community thing to see as well. So I do agree. It is, I think, harder if you don't have those groups. But I do also think there are people out there willing to make it happen for you as well, which is quite a cool community aspect as well.
So the reason...
And the events are so fun.
Yeah, the reason why I like team events so much is because Flesh and Blood is actually a team game at its core. Nobody who's successful in Flesh and Blood does it by themselves. They do it with other people supporting them, whether it's for testing, theory, etc. Like, it's a team-based game, and all the best players in the game are sort of an example of that. And it just transitions really nicely into something like a team sealed, even when it's occasional, because you do actually get to play, not a non-zero sum with your teammates, right? Oftentimes you're trying to game the gem, or, just hoping you don't get paired. But now you get to actually team up with your teammates and go against other people. It's really, really fun. It's also a totally different way to play Flesh and Blood. Like, you're so used to playing 1v1, but once you start playing team events, just the dynamic of having those three, you three sitting next to each other, other, talking to each other, and all the metagaming that goes into it. It's like, okay, who do we put on seat one? Do we put the most unknown player on the team in seat one so people can't metagame us before? Like it just adds so many more dynamics to an already incredible game that it's definitely very, very fun. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't tried it yet to definitely give it a shot, because I mean, it's totally different, right? You finish your game, you go put your little chair behind your teammate, you're washing all their hands, etc.
Yeah, you're making me want to play more team events right now. I remember this is, Sydney calling. We sit there. We've got Dr. Dan in the middle on Kano. I'm on the right on Rhino. We got Nick Butcher on the left on Ultim. Just playing our games, just enjoying everything. What do you think of? You've done some team drafts, notoriously.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty good though, as I heard.
Yeah, as long as I'm not there. What is your thoughts on a top 4 team draft as the kind of, like, do you think team draft is a thing that can work sort of at a tier 2 event, at least in the form of something like a Battle Hardened?
Oh, to be honest, Hayden, I don't know, because I feel like this is something that might be outside of my wheelhouse. Like, I'm not anticipating what variables make this not competitively viable, because in my mind, playing it at a casual level, or even playing it for buddy matches on like day 3 of a tournament or something, I think it's a great format. So it's one of my favorite formats, because there's so much more metagaming that goes into it and strategy. It's very, very fun. So it seems like it could transition into a competitive format for me, but I'm assuming because I've never heard of it being officially supported, that there maybe is some pitfalls to it from a competitive integrity standpoint. I don't know, but enjoyability wise, hell yeah, it's better than Team Sealed in my opinion.
I think if you've got competitive players playing this on the regular and wanting to play this format, it's probably a reason to at least investigate it. So I think that's what Alice is doing. It'll be interesting to see how this event goes. So yeah, Battle Hardened, Baltimore, Team Sealed, and 2 top 4 team draft. I guess last in the news, Brendan, just want to give another shout out. I think we talked about this briefly on the last pod, but we did a Patreon pod last week that referenced Cathartigan's Gorganian Tome on YouTube's video around Flesh and Blood is a fighting game, which if you haven't seen that video already, go check it out. I think I retweeted it on Twitter as well. But anyway, it's a great video. And also if you're looking for our latest Patreon pod, if you're a patron, then we also covered that.
Mm-hmm. And tell me why Kano's not a grappler, because he's the number 1 grappler in Flesh and Blood. On to the Command & Cookout. Speaking of Singapore, we never do these creative lead-ins. I don't think anybody knows this, by the way, but all those Command & Cookout, those BS lead-ins you've heard for the past 2 years, yeah, those are never rehearsed. Those are just done live. That's why sometimes we come to this section, I'm like, oh shit, what about Singaporean cuisine can we spice into here? I don't have anything this time, but I'll have something next week, Hayden. What do you have for the question?
I'm off to a hawker's fall, aren't I? This week's question. So if you want to get your questions in for the Command & Cookout, please do. We had a flood of questions over the last 2 weeks. So we have some amazing questions, sort of, I guess, back catalogued over the next few weeks. But at some point soon, we'll probably dive into another mailbag as well. So if you do have questions that you want read on the show, please send them in. We love getting your questions, and there's been some really interesting questions that have come through. This one, though, interestingly, Brendan, this is the question that had the most, I guess, thumbs up or likes or upvotes, whatever you want to say, on the last week's YouTube video. And I thought quite interesting question, a little bit fun, a little bit shorter. We've had a pretty big lead into the show here. The question is, and it comes from Michael or Mikkel, I guess. Based on Hayden's professional fashion background, if Fab were to make merch, how would you envision the designs? Brendan, I even prepared one for you today. I even wearing the Arsenal Pass jersey.
You should see the T-shirt. The T-shirt looks way better. Yeah.
The T is better.
It's so good. The T actually has got a great fit. Sorry, I interrupted you. Based on Hayden's professional fashion background, if Fab were to make merch, how would you envision the designs? I think you should just change this to if Arsenal Pass was to make merch, commercially available merch at that.
2 things there. Firstly, I guess if people do want, we actually made some tees. We gave some away. We wore them at the last event. If people do like what we did, we might consider putting these out available for public sale if people do want them. So let us know. I mean, this is the jersey, as I say. I wouldn't redo this one. I think I would do it slightly differently. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm holding it up right now. I'm wearing it. It has a print on the back, which I don't know if you can really see.
Yeah, we also have a new, you can see that print, but we have a new logo now. We basically repurposed the limited time only one. I think that's going to be the Arsenal Pass logo moving forward. It's much cleaner, much more minimalist. I mean, if you're listening to this and you would like your logo right next to our logo on that t-shirt, just hit us up, because a good sponsorship is a great reason to create some merch. Honestly, the main reason we haven't done it for anybody that really wants that stuff is, holy crap, the logistics. Oh my god. Oh man, they are not fun.
Yeah, F and logistics. Anyway, quick question. I guess the answer to this question is, I think LSS have started to back into more, and you're seeing it more and more with the sleeve design in particular. So sleeves available for sale, these Dragon Shield sleeves. That's kind of the biggest merch they've done so far, right? And it's really hero-centric, which makes a lot of sense, right? I think Flesh and Blood is obviously, it's a class-based game, it's a hero-based game. People have affinity for the classes, heroes, like me and Brendan talked about at the top of the show and sort of went back and forth on about Light Illusionist, for instance. That's where people really, I think, draw connection. And so that makes sense, as like kind of making merch available for that standpoint. And I think obviously LSS have already identified that, and they're doing that in the form of sleeves. I would love to see, talking about obviously, I guess, I mean, you say fashion, but merch. I think playmats available for sale. I think we've gone through this whole cycle. I know they've used playmats for armory prizes, for with your event entry. Dude, how many playmats do you have? I have to get rid of some the other day, because I have about 35, 40 playmats. Like, they are for everything. I wonder if at some point they kind of move away from that a little bit. I know we're starting to see more optional tag-ons at events if you want to get the playmat or not. People want to collect them. I get that. I would love to see them just do some, like, other than just the basic fab playmat, maybe just some basic like hero based, or maybe slightly different designs. Like the world. Do you remember the world map that was available at
Yes,
Worlds?
that's the best one by far. Nothing comes
It's amazing.
close. Yes.
It's amazing. But I could also see that one just being like commercially available,
Yes.
as like one of their 5 sort of core ranges they do year round or something. Then they change it next year to, they keep one of the core ones, but they change in 4 seasonal styles or something. I think that's a great way to do playmats as well.
Water bottle from Worlds.
People want them.
You remember that?
Yes, again. I remember everyone scrambling to try and get them.
Apparently, oh yeah. So I want to say who did it, but someone I know sold their white one, which is like apparently a Chase water bottle for like hundreds of dollars. I was like, what the hell? Yeah. So I gotta ask you a question about playmats, Hayden. When you first started playing card games, did you have an interest in playmats and collecting playmats?
No, never.
Okay, so I did. I'm wondering if that is just the natural progression of a TCG player, is that they acquire a bunch of playmats to begin with, and then they realize that, like, this literally weighs 170 pounds and exists in my closet. You just get so many. How would you envision the designs for merch? I mean, you talked about it a little bit. Could they do t-shirts or something like that? Would people buy that? Would that be something that's cool? I think one of the coolest things about, like you mentioned, the World's playmat. We talked about the water ball. The coolest things about that is that they're less the physical item, but more the token of the experience, right? So yep. I think if there was a water bottle online, I wouldn't give a shit about it, to be honest. But if I get one at Worlds and now I can have this, and in 5 years, if I still have it, I look back and I remember that experience. That means something to me. I do think that less in the sort of line of selling stuff on a website or something for them. I do hope that at professional events, even callings, to be honest, they start doing more merch, right? They start doing more items that can help you. Help you remember those experiences, and more sort of what would you call it? Items that can be used for, like pens, water bottles.
Yeah. Yep.
Pins, all that kind of stuff. They can definitely do more there, because when you show up at a calling and you just kind of get your generic promo or you get your playmat, like the playmat just goes in the closet with the other playmats. So, like, let's be real, unless it's the World's one.
Well, there's just so many of them at this point. Like, and don't get me wrong, I think some of them, and they're all have this place and they're all amazing. A lot of them are amazing anyway. I think there's that point, right? But at some point there is like burnout and fatigue of the amount of like a certain piece of merchandise. Go back to something that like Magic did. They often changed theirs. They went through a period of using like pins, like you just talked about. My favorite period was like they used like tops, like t-shirts or like polo shirts, right? Yeah. So you go to this event, I still have mine. Like I have mine from like my national championships, rock up to like, I've got my 2007 national championships, like polo top, like these things were really cool. I thought my Grand Prix 2006, like with the Grand Prix logo and where the Grand Prix locations were, like a band tee for that year. Yep. Like those sorts of things I think are really cool, right? And whether you just have those available for sale at the event, I think those are cool. You rock up to the event, maybe you're not playing, maybe you're going to go for the spectacle, you're going to play side events at the World Championships in 2023, for instance, and you rock up to the merch table, you buy yourself your tea. Here's my tea. I'm like, this is my takeaway from this event. I got to play amazing games with people all weekend, and I got this cool tee to remind me of it that I'm gonna go and wear at my locals and be like, yeah, I was at Worlds. Like those are those when I think about clothing or apparel, I think those are the opportunities that LSS has to do some merch is in that space. Or something that Magic did that I friggin' loved is they just did collaborations with people who are actually good at this sort of thing. Like LSS, they're not a clothing company, right? They don't know how to do this, but they can pair with someone who knows how to do it, and they can make some cool tees and stuff like that.
Red Legend Story X Louis Vuitton bag coming out now.
We could start a little bit lower, you know what I'm saying? But
no, I just want to just one anecdote. I do really enjoy the t-shirts as well. For instance, there's been a few people that have given me playmats over the years, whether it's for their channel or maybe given me a resource token. I'm going to be honest. Those things they go in the closet. That's just how it is. I've got too many of them. I've had one person though give me a t-shirt, and I probably wear that t-shirt, I don't know, 4 times a month at this point. It's the fabrec.gg t-shirt. I work out in that t-shirt. Like I do. And it actually means something to me because I don't know, it's flesh and blood, and I guess it's another workout tee, but I think it's cool. And that was just, I don't know, it just has so much more impact on me than something like a playmat or a resource token or something like that. Something that, I obviously, or not obviously, but it's very likely I will have something that already serves that function. I already have a playmat. I have to play with the Arsenal Pass one. That's just how it is. I already have a resource token. I have to play with our token. That's just how it is. So yeah, big fan of t-shirts on my end. And I would love some polos. It's all about the ego, right? If you can take that shirt to your locals and just flex on the locals,
Yeah, polo shirts coming soon just for Brendan. But anyway, interesting question, and kind of, I guess, on the theme of things we've been talking about today, which is a little bit more about events and
I thought you were going to say navigating
the game itself. Yes, well, great segue. Let's talk about navigating Endgames like a pro, Brendan Patrick. Firstly, want to ask.
Yep, I was going to ask.
Wow, you can ask then. Where you go.
Yeah, so what, like Hayden just described for everybody, what is an endgame? Like, what does it mean in Flesh and Blood? Like, specifically, is it related to your game plan from the start? Is it related to how you play throughout the game, or is it literally just related to a specific instance in the game, the literal end game, the last turn, the last few turns, the second cycle? Expand upon your definition, sir.
Yeah, I think it's actually a really hard thing to nail down exactly when you transition to the end game, because people will have different definitions. Naturally, it depends on the matchup you're playing in the deck. But I think one of the best ways you can define what is an in-game in Flesh and Blood is basically when either hero, so either one or the other or both, are within lethal range, basically. So where damage is going to come in at any given time that can deal or present lethal. That is what I think is an in-game in Flesh and Blood. So I can give an example of this, right? You're playing an Outsiders limited match, and both players have gotten below 8 health. Now both are within this kind of potential lethal range, and you're entering into an in-game of what the match could be. Take a more extreme example. You're playing Classic Constructed. You're playing Kano. You got your opponent to 27 life, as Brendan likes to say.
Or you could be at
27
40.
life.
Double essence.
Sure. Hey. But if we're, maybe they're playing AB2, we're being a bit more realistic about it. 27 life. Now you've got your wildfire set up. You're into an in-game. You're playing an in-game. Is your opponent playing an in-game? Maybe not, right? So, and that's kind of what I think also matters, is that an in-game doesn't encompass necessarily just what is happening for the table. It could be a little bit one-sided, because also some players might have a particular in-game, and that actually might be a mid-game for another player. So it really can kind of depend. But I think that one of the best ways to put it is that you start to enter an in-game when players are in this lethal range of life totals, and or also into the second and third cycles of their deck, starting to move through towards a very rapid end to a game for potential fatigue reasons.
I love the idea that you sit across from a hero and the end game starts when you roll when you flip the hero. How do you win them? Like, talk to me about what we talk about. End games being represented differently in different heroes, right? Maybe Fi not being a sort of end game oriented deck, but then we have a deck that's very popular right now, Oldhim, being something it's basically built around the end game. how can you exploit your understanding of endgames, and how can you win them? Like, what
both
sort
decks
of
have probably pretty similar endgames. It's a pretty linear format. It's not like class constructed where you bring your own deck and strategies very massively.
I think
there's
the
three
first thing
classes
to kind
now
of
recognize is
limited.
that they
You just
all
said,
have to have an endgame. I think the kind of or close to the same card pool, at least share a card pool, you even get to like how do you win those, etc. So it's a bit more linear.
Does every
but
deck
when you
have an
talk about
endgame?
class constructed, and are they built
spoke
equal,
about Fi,
right?
like we just gave an example of like an Outsiders Limited match,
something like Ultim's in-game, and they can look very, very different, but ultimately they both have in-games. It's just that the pace at which you reach your in-game could be a lot faster. Fire's playing an aggro mirror. The in-game could start anywhere from turns 2, honestly, through to 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Versus an Ultim mirror, the in-game really doesn't start until you hit second cycle, and life totals are starting to approach that sub 20 mark, which can be, I guess, based on that, a dozen or 8 to 9 turns into the game. So as a minimum, a dozen turns into the game.
Yeah, so when I look at a deck like Fi, it's kind of hard to be like, does this deck have an endgame? I think it has an endgame strategy, right? And the endgame strategy is to avoid the opponent's deck's endgame, right? Because your strategy is that I need to kill my opponent before I run out of threats in my deck, right? Before I reach some sort of ratio dilution of having blues to reds in my decks to where I literally cannot kill my opponent if they're at some sort of life total threshold. That is an endgame strategy, right? But your core strategy is really avoiding what would traditionally be seen as the quote unquote end game from an Oldhim deck. You need to win before then because you don't have enough resources or gas to get through. You don't have some recurring threat, whether it's a Dread of Brutality, which is going to be legal, or something like Kadachi's, etc.
Yeah, and decks can have different end games. So Fire, for example, you get to an end game where you've got your opponent down to 2 to 3 life, or 1 to 2 life. Phoenix Flame is your end game. You've got this inevitability potentially of an end game versus, like you just spoke about before, something like Ultim. I mean, one of your biggest end game strategies is to make sure that you can hold tempo into your end game so that you don't have to block, because as soon as you have to block with all your 2 blocks, now you're in trouble, right? Now you're on the back foot. You're potentially going to lose more cards out of your deck. Your life total is going to get lower, and you're not going to have another pivot spot. So end games can look different even with the same deck, which I think people really often, one of the downfalls I see people make when they sort of come up with their deck for Flesh and Blood, or they rock up to a tournament, is they're like, well, every game's going to end the same because I'm playing an aggro deck. And every game's going to end with me doing X. And they don't really have contingency plans for different heroes, different matchups, or what happens if that end game doesn't eventuate, because sometimes it won't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of prelude to endgames is game planning, right? And you need to have sort of a spatial awareness of how you plan to win and navigate every single game, and where how your deck strategy will change as you transition from what could be seen as the early game to the mid game and now to the end game, right? And maybe in the case of something like 5, the life totals are fast up. Maybe you just don't win the end game. But like Hayden said, if you do have your opponent down at something like 2 or 3, your endgame strategy does change. You're prioritizing that Phoenix Flame. You're making sure you're swinging with weapons if you did have something like Kadachi, etc. Hayden, I know this is a bit ephemeral, right? But let's talk about some examples. What are some endgames that are representative in the current meta?
Yeah, so I think there's a ton of really interesting in-games. So like I said before, every deck is going to have an in-game. I think the argument more is that some decks don't have a mid-game. Some decks just have an early and then an in-game. But I think there's some really interesting, complex in-games in this current meta. And that's a big part of the reason why we want to talk about it now. Like, why talk about in-games now? We could talk about it in 112 episodes before this. And we've talked about, pitch stacking and second cycle and things like that, but the actual complexity of in-games is probably higher than it's ever been. And I'll just give a few examples. So Ultim versus Dromai. If you've watched the 2-hour mammoth semi-final between Michael Feng and Yuha at Pro Tour Baltimore, a great example of how complex these in-games can be between these two decks. And I think this matchup is one that's been played a lot now in the current meta, just with basically 2 of the top 3 most played decks being Ultim and Dromai. And it really comes down to kind of how the Ultim has navigated it with sort of poppers, how the Dromai has navigated it with their kind of ghostly touch, passing mirage sort of in-game. So, and it can look a little bit different depending on your strategy, depending on what the Ultim does. So a very complex in-game that definitely goes very often towards second, third cycles. Lexi versus Ultim, especially if the Ultim is going to try and fatigue that Lexi. That's a really interesting in-game that revolves around, the Lexi player getting to second cycle and using things like codexes to make sure that they have their threat density still left, pitching rain razors and 3 of a kinds together earlier to set up these big push turns. An in-game strategy that involves basically transitioning from a mid game where maybe you land a drill shot on a rampart into having enough damage in your in game. I mean, Lexi versus Azuri is another interesting one. Azuri looks to take the game long and grind out the Lexis and run them out of cards, right, effectively, or kill them through this chip damage. Viserai vs Bravo has been another one we've seen a bit pop up. Katsu versus Ultim is another one as well. I mean, that one I think is really interesting, and we haven't seen as much of it, and we won't see as much, obviously, with Ultim Living Legend. But these Katsu decks have this access to this inevitability now with Dojo and the sort of timestamp McGinty line that people are playing to just shuffle in threat density. So traditionally it's like Katsu, you just run out of threats, and now you have all this way to like just continue to keep threat density. So there's a lot of really interesting in-games in this meta, and I think we haven't seen this before. I mean, if I throw back to some previous metas, it's like dash control in the in-game, or maybe the Icelander versus Ultim in-game, but they were a bit more. They were fewer and far between, I think, and now there's quite a lot of really interesting and complex in-games in this current sort of format.
Mm-hmm. So if we understand that every deck will need to at least participate or be cognizant in the end game in some way, despite whether you define yourself as an early game focused deck like an aggro deck or not, you need to be prepared for it. How does this change things like deck building and some of the strategies that you're planning to employ when you're thinking about what cards to put in said deck?
Yeah, well, I think are we gonna aggro? We're gonna be rush down decks now. We rush down people. I mean, great question. Like, so I guess when it comes to building and strategizing and card choices, I mean, it matters a lot, I think. And this is what I was saying before about, I think people come with this one size fits all approach too often. And I think that's worked in previous metas. It's like, hey, this is my fire deck. This is what my fire deck does. Hey, this is my Icelander deck, and I'm going to chip, Wounded Bull, E-strike you, and then I'm going to boot you at the end of the game. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, here's an Ultim deck that's going to recur Warhorns and try and fatigue you. What are you going to do into that? Yeah. And I think that strategy was so successful because people didn't have the answer to it. They didn't have an understanding of what their end game would look like. So I think when you look at basically, I think always the best way to first approach it is like, okay, what is my linear end game? That's kind of what we talk about, right? Like, how do I want to end the game ideally? And repeatability of having the same end games is going to be great, right? That's how you have consistency. It's how you make it easy. It's how you just like stick to a strategy and win games, right? But then beyond that, it's like, okay, what are the other strategies in the format? What do my opponent's end games look like? And then how am I going to interact with that? Because if I have in-game X and my opponent has in-game Y and they don't gel together, something's got to give, right? Something's got to break. And in testing, if you find it's consistently your in-game that's being undermined and not working, you've got to have a different strategy. You've got to have a different way to approach that in-game. And I know people focus a lot on this kind of idea of meshing game plans or sort of matchup plans, right? But they often focus on the early and the mid-game, or holistically. They go like, well, my opponent's plan is fatigue, so here's my anti-fatigue strategy. But what they might not think about is, what does the specific how do I actually finish the game off? How do I win the game? And that can be a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I feel like in the Oldhim, the current, well, I guess it's the past at this point, almost. The Oldhim versus Dromai matchup, a lot of the Oldhim's endgame, it seems like, is actually countering the Dromai's endgame, right? Like, there's a lot of there's some things you have to worry about in the early to mid game. You really got to be careful of the Automatai. You got to be careful of like a lot of Rake the Embers, getting too far ahead on board. But then once you settle into this mid game, there's a lot of posturing, and if your Dromai opponent is ticking up that ghostly touch, is developing things like the time snap potion, has pitched the passing mirages, like, you see a clear way in which they're trying to win the game, and the Oldhim player needs to maintain enough threat density in order to deny that, right? In order, not threat density, but popper density in order to deny that, and potentially needs things like we saw in Michael Fang's match versus Yuha, have something like the staunch responses for inevitably when that passing mirage takes Phantasm off the ghostly touch. You need a value block on it as well as having the threat density. So Oldhim, a lot of that deck strategy into Dromai is actually just countering what the Dromai is showing you through the way they deploy their threats onto the board and through the way they pitch their deck.
Yeah, it's like counter. It's like steps, it's like levels, right? Level 0 is the Ultim just killing the Dromai, right? Level 1 is the Dromai navigating poppers and getting to an in-game. Level 2 is the Ultim countering that in-game strategy, right? Making sure they've got enough poppers, making sure they've got a way to deal with ghostly touch, keeping the life total high, whatever it is, right? Dealing with the key dragons. Level 3, though, that's the next one. That's maybe what we didn't quite see Yuha execute, but it looked like Yuha was trying to move towards this, is navigating the counter plan that Ultim has to counter the counter effectively. And that's literally what it is. It's like levels to Endgames. I'll give you another example. Briar versus Ultim. This is one that we played a lot of prior to Pro Tour Lille. We've really tried to understand this matchup. And it was like, okay, level 1, especially as these fatigue Ultims really became popular, it's like, okay, level 1 is like, as a Briar, you just smash him. You just kill him. You don't let him. Yeah, you just CMH turns, whatever. Ultim, hey, we can get through these CMH turns and then we can fatigue them. Okay, Briar's response. Okay, the response to this counter or this in-game strategy is making sure that we've got recursive ways to bring back our most powerful threats. So tomorrow we saw rights of replenishment really come to the forefront. Let's go to the next stage. Okay, Ultim. Okay, we need to make sure that we have ways to counter this.
Spinal. So, counter stack spinal.
It's like exactly counter stack on hit effects. Okay, here's the next layer in for Briar. We've got cards like Give and Take in the format now. These amazing, cards that can even more recursive power, and we can push really big turns. Ultim again responds, I'm gonna pitch defense reactions. So my counter pitch is now my way I'm responding to you. It's kind of similar to the spinal thing. So this kind of evolution of layering on top of game plans is literally what in-games and evolution of in-games look like. And that's what they are in Flesh and Blood. Even if people haven't necessarily identified this or they don't talk about it this way, that's literally what it is. Player A rocks up to an event, does really well in an event and shows off a strategy that counters something. Next time, people have adapted to the strategy, they come with a counter strategy. But the person who's a level up from them has thought of the counter to the counter. You know what I mean? They've been in testing. So let's use an example from Baltimore. Everyone goes to Baltimore. They go, Lexi is so powerful, right? Here's the Lexi strategy. And this is how they're beating Ultims with codexes and stuff. The Ultims respond and go, this is our plan. And then we see the best Lexis who top 8, I think you have a counter to counter plan. Lightning Press was it's a really big card for that sort of counter plan that people showed up with Baltimore. We saw, I think Max have it in top 8 as well. So we see it in action all the time. I think people just don't talk about the fact that these often revolve around end games. They're specific situations or cards or things that interact with getting into the end game and doing a specific task effectively.
It's dynamic, right? It is dynamic. And I think Flesh and Blood is, in relation to other card games, it is the card game where you play against your opponent the most, less than you just play your deck, right? Decks just don't tend to win by themselves. Of course, there are outliers, but most of the time, even Endgame is where it is most important. But through the early game, the mid game, and the end game, you are reacting to your opponent. You're adjusting your strategy based off what your opponent is doing. You're sort of reading into their turn-to-turn plays, right? And if you extend into the end game, you get into deeper territory, right? Now you're seeing perfect information on their second cycle, or close to, Crown of Seeds, Sink Below, maybe not perfect, close to, and now you can manipulate your own deck as a way to counter that. And the levels, I guess technically, or not technically, but they would seem to go infinitely deep. But at some point, it's your game plan is able to beat what your opponent is trying to do to counter you, and you sort of come out on top on this loop. And it's very, very, it's what makes the game fun, right? Is that right there? Is you legitimately get to play against your opponent. You're not just playing your deck in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, and I think it's more prevalent, or at least it's more tangible when you get to these formats where you have second, third cycles, because now you've got this element of strategy that wasn't available for an in-game prior, because in-games were a lot shorter. They arrived sooner in previous formats. I think one word of warning I want to give, though, is that if you're taking this approach or kind of thinking about what we've talked about today in terms of navigating in-games, one thing I think people can do is they can swing the pendulum too far the other way, and they get so focused on this iterative sort of idea of in-games that they show up, they go okay, this is how I'm going to counter the in-game. Oh, my opponent's just going route 1 and just going to destroy me, and I'm not ready.
I have an example.
Because I've
very recent example. So in the Realm Games tournament in top 8, there was Kano versus Lexi, Yuanji, Leon, Lexi, and the Kano player. Oh, I forget their name because they actually went by a nickname. They told me and I forgot. But you see the Kano player turn 0, get energy potion onto the board, and it looks, you can tell by the posturing that's done over the next 1 to 3 turns that there's likely a wildfire in arsenal. And then you see the Kano player proceed to pass. Take damage, pass. It's because they realize with energy potion, with having access to 15 resources with energy potion and spellfire cloak, that they can play Aether Wildfire, potentially double Wildfire if they find it. But more importantly, Wildfire, Lessons in Lava, go find, Lessons in Lava, go find, Blazing Ether, and that's 40 damage, right? And the Lexi player has access to Arcane Barrier 1, and if the Lexi player overextends at Arcane Barrier 0, that is a 40 damage combo. We see the Kano player hyper-focus on that endgame. Game starts, see correct cards, endgame is now in effect, right? We talked about that potential against Kano. But due to focusing on that endgame, right, and the condition, the variable, is just too unlikely. The Lexi player must have 0 cards to pitch to Arcane Barrier to die from 40, which was the life total. We see the player ultimately lose that game because, like you said, they went a little too deep, right? They saw the win, they saw the end game, but you could not reliably have the Lexi player meet the said conditions to win that game without first putting on pressure, right? That was sort of the key metric that was sort of forgone when we employed that strategy. So there was no pressure, there was no tax on the Lexi player's hand.
Well, there's 2 players playing that game, right? So in your example, one player has jumped straight to the end game. The Lexi player on the other side, hey, they're still playing the early and mid game, and that's kind of what it's about, is like identifying and navigating. And the the jar's empty, Brendan. The Lexi player might have also identified that, hey, look, my Kano opponent feels they're at their end game right now. My current situation is that that's not where we're at. Yeah. We're very much in the middle of this game for me. I'm going to continue to apply pressure while denying their in-game, which is something I'd love to talk about to sort of wrap this up, is denying in-games. And then I'm going to get to my in-game. And then my in-game is going to line up better into their in-game because I've done XYZ, for instance. So yeah, it's a really interesting concept. It's really fluid, I think, as well, what in-games can look like. But yeah, that's a really cool example.
Yep. Like you said, I mean, the Lexi player in that position just needs to, after you see your Kano opponent pass, play the energy potion, assist the card in arsenal, you have to ask yourself, how do I lose this game? Then you simply do the math, right? Simply do the math. Across almost every strategy that can be implemented onto you, the most likely, of course, is double lesson, because of significantly lower variance in something like double wildfire, and that's 40 damage. And all you have to do is, like, I keep 1 resource in hand, no chance I lose this game, right? Well, Kano can always go nuclear. So
always a chance.
There's always some bologna sandwich waiting for you. Yeah.
I want to talk about denying in-games. Obviously, there's a lot of strategies when it comes to in-games and how you can set these up. And there's, we could use a lot of examples for decks that we've played as well. Chain, Kano, Viserai, I think. Yeah. Viserai versus Fatigue, for instance, if anyone's ever seen that infamous match, my national finals. But there's a lot of different sort of things. I think that's a great example. If you haven't seen this match, it was my national finals, the January of last year, and my opponent on Ultim has a strategy basically to get to an in-game where they have too much life for me to be able to skill out a combo. It's an interesting
Chain
matchup.
versus Prism with the Arclight Sentinels, and just it's very prevalent, right? Like, especially in past Western Blood. Now in modern day, we went through a period, like you said, where it was less popular, but nowadays you absolutely need to keep it in mind.
Snag for the Riftbind stack at the end of a game, and then navigating that by just holding Riftbinds and Banish and doing it all again.
Yeah. Shots at LSS. Anyway. Snag was a bad card, never worked.
Hey, we haven't seen that card much since then, have we? How can you deny in-games? I think this is a sort of a last sort of interesting concept. So, firstly, the biggest thing is identifying what an in-game looks like for yourself, for an opponent. It's really important. So I think your example kind of shows exactly how you can deny in-games. You just showed that whether that Kano player jumped straight to it or not, the Lexi player responded by trying to deny the in-game. And I think that is something that we see in other strategies as well. So if I take Dash, the control Dash decks, right, as an example, they're trying to get to a point where they're able to gain life, soak up damage while getting items on the board to then transition to this in-game, which is effectively chip damage. So we transition, we transition to this in-game where now they take this overwhelming 15 damage return starts to come in off 2 to 3 cards, and they can present this really big chunks of damage really efficiently. How do you deny that? Well, either your strategy might be to get their life total below a certain point, say below 10, so that they can't ever keep enough cards in hand in their in-game to pressure you this way. Or so you can potentially run them out of cards or force them to block and leak through damage. Your strategy might be to actually get rid of some of these items somehow. So force them to discard cards. Righteous Cleansing is a card in the Guardians that have come up more recently. Arg Smash if you're a brute player, for instance. So there's always ways to deny in-games. And I think when you can identify that decks have really strong in-games, and I think there's a few examples in this format, Ultim, Dash in particular, Uzuri is another, even Lexi, these decks have really strong potential in-games. If you can identify what those in-games are based on the deck that you're playing, then you can find ways to counter it and ways to sort of make sure you have a way to stop their endgame going in.
Mm-hmm. The heuristic is to counter endgames, and I would arguably say to win endgames is you need to understand your opponent's endgames. How does your opponent's deck win the game? How can you potentially lose the game? You need to be thinking about this constantly as you play Flesh and Blood, but also there is knowledge that you can enter games with prior to knowing your opponent, right? Which is how does this Oldhim deck that's popular in the meta tend to win the game? What is the strategy they will implement on me? And starting from turn one, if I'm playing something like Alexi, I know that I need to be considering, like, if this game goes longer past X period, I need to be preparing from turn zero. Like I need to have threat density. I need to be setting up my deck, etc. So I think one of the most important things is just understanding your opponent's endgame. Like that's step one. It sounds obvious, but it's not.
Yeah, and your own endgame. That might be step one, step two. But like, it's endgames don't happen by accident. Do you know what I mean? Like the way that you get to you execute your endgames, like. Very rarely, I'll say at least, do they happen by accident. Very often they are planned, and the player who plans and sets up is in a much better position majority of the time. So it's well worth doing. I guess maybe to just kind of end it on a few things to keep in mind when it comes to navigating and mastering in-games. Get the reps, have these plans, understand what they are so that you can enact them. Know how the opponent can disrupt your plans as well. That's that next step we talked about. Identify your pivot points is really important as well. So when is the early transition to mid? When is the mid transition to end? And how your game plans might sort of travel through this depending on what you're playing against. So does your in-game come sooner because your opponent's leaking damage and you thought they wouldn't? Does it come later because they're more defensive?
You had to block with Ninth Blade. How are you pivoting? Or like some sort of key end-game card has now been depleted from your deck, whether you're playing Chain or something, like you lost a key Riftbind, etc. Like your end game and your potential damage output to actually close this game out has now changed, and you have to adapt.
Don't block with those cards. I can't tell you though, like during testing and like learning a matchup or learning an in-game, how many times I get to the in-game and go, I shouldn't have blocked that card, or I pitched this card on the wrong turn, or I played this card too early or whatever. Like there's so many learnings I think when it comes to in-games. I want to ask you one last question to round it out there, Brendan, is what do you think in-games will look like moving forward? Of course, we know Oldhim's hitting Living Legend. That's a big contributor to some pretty complex in-games heading out the window. Rosetta Thorn is not gone, which is interesting. So what that means, I don't know. Assassin, though, is really popular and gaining popularity. Azuri, especially with Oldhim leaving, I can see that only gaining popularity. Dramai, of course, again, probably one of its worst matchups heading out the window. Depends who you talk to. But so where do you think in-games go from here? And will we continue to see in-games be important in Flesh and Blood in the way that they probably have been in this past format?
Jonah Vitality. Just kidding.
Oh, and Blitz. It's in Blitz.
Jonah Vitality and Blitz. It's so funny because I'll get there later. It's a tangent. Where do they go? With Rosetta Thorn, I think they stay. Oldhim is an archetype. I think it's just the most effective version of that archetype we've ever seen, the most streamlined, the most efficient, etc. But some deck will sort of fill that role. Maybe not cover as many bases, right? Where it's also the tempo deck and the fatigue deck, and you're like, but there is going to be another deck that is going to try to attrition decks out. And I think that you're presented with similar endgame scenarios. Maybe you have less complexity in the early to mid game where you're having to actually be worried about Oldhim's pressure on hit effects, etc. But this sort of puzzle where you have to figure out how to deplete your opponent's life total to zero, despite them blocking with all of their cards, disrupting you with on hit effects, etc. It will still be prevalent. So I don't think that changes. Ultimately, with something like Rosetta gone, I'm not sure it changes the fundamental concept. I think it's here to stay, and I think it will always just be contextual on what is in the meta right now, right? Like it is a core facet of Flesh and Blood gameplay is endgames. Like they occur sort of, I would say outside of whatever the current meta conditions are, right? It just simply shifts. So Oldhim leaves, Rosetta leaves, doesn't matter. The goalpost just sort of moves on what the current meta is and what decks will need to adapt and how with their end games.
Yeah, I think it's more about the complexity of in-games. Like we said, my argument would be that all decks have an early and an in-game. Some decks might not have a mid-game, or they have a very short window for a mid-game. I think all decks have some sort of in-game, right? It's just about identifying that. But I think the complexity and the nature of how large these in-games are and this current format in particular has been really interesting to me. I think that and for me, the key pillars are going to be, I think, Assassin and Dromai for what those look like heading into this next format. But I am really interested to see how it kind of goes, because also we get another Illusionist, and of course we get another Shadow Runeblade. So yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Angels, or whatever they're doing to try to fix Spectra. Anyway, Endgames. For those of you listening on audio platforms, Hayden, I don't know if I interrupted you there. I had a little...
I was going to say, speaking of Endgames.
Speaking of Endgames, the Endgame of the podcast. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, there's a video version on YouTube at youtube.com/ArsenalPass. Hayden and I on Twitter, at Brendan APG, and at Fiend_Dale. Yeah, check out the Patreon if you're interested. We do have deck packs and deck guides going up on there. We'll have more for national season, I'm sure. But also, Hayden, like Hayden mentioned, there is a great video on there discussing archetypes in Flesh and Blood based off of Gorgain and Tom's video. And I think we nailed it pretty good. Other than that, that's it for the week. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.